And I hope that, before it was assumed that peace with the Arab world had to go through the Palestinians. First, you have to solve the most thorny conflict with the Palestinians, and then the other Arab countries will come around. And I remember Secretary of State John Kerry saying, read my lips, separate peace accords with the UAE, not going to happen. And then the Trump administration proved him wrong.
Yeah.
That was the inside-out strategy. Solve the hardest problem, then you do the easier ones. The genius of the Abraham Accords is to do an outside-in strategy. You start with the countries that have never had a direct conflict with Israel and share interests with it, like Morocco and the UAE. Then you move into the countries that have a bit more conflict, like Saudi Arabia. And eventually, when the Palestinians realize that the Arab world isn't going to give them indefinite credit, they're going to be the ones who are going to sue for peace on the best terms they can get, instead of thinking that the Arab world will help them bleed Israel dry until they get the best terms that they want.
What do you make of the fact that literally nobody wants the Palestinians? Like, if we were to just believe the narrative, and let's say Israel was the most evil country in the history of the world and committing genocide and all these things, let's just pretend all of that was true, and it's all, of course, not true. If all of that was true, you would think that 1 out of 22 Arab nations might be willing to take in 3 Palestinians. None have taken in any. I guess a few of them are now showing up on the streets of Paris. But what do you make of that? That in essence, they want the conflict to continue because nobody wants the Palestinians.
I think many Arab states are beginning to realize the Frankenstein's monster that they have created. The reason that after Israel's war of independence, the Palestinians who were displaced received their own UN agency that uniquely in the world keeps them as refugees generation after generation, receiving American taxpayer money for free healthcare until such a day as they can move to Tel Aviv and destroy the state of Israel. The reason the Arab nations did that was to wage a forever war against Israel. Once these Arab states realized that Israel is actually important for regional security in the Middle East, and they have more to gain by working together with Israel, trading with Israel, building military alliances with Israel, what are they supposed to do with this ideology that they have created that is waging a forever war against Israel, cannot reconcile itself to Israel's existence in any borders whatsoever, and is determined, as they say, from the river to the sea, which means no Israel. And I'll say to my enemies' credit, when they say things, I take them at their word.
Yeah.
They understand that there is a very serious extremism problem here. And whereas Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, American allies, have taken amazing steps to de-radicalize their curricula, move their populations in a more open-minded direction, the Palestinians have done the opposite. Because they believe that the war of 1948 is still not over. That Israel will ultimately disappear if only they put enough pressure, if only they commit enough barbaric atrocities against it, if only they drag it into enough perpetual conflict that they can bleed the country dry. And I hope that, before it was assumed that peace with the Arab world had to go through the Palestinians. First, you have to solve the most thorny conflict with the Palestinians, and then the other Arab countries will come around. And I remember Secretary of State John Kerry saying, read my lips, separate peace accords with the UAE, not going to happen. And then the Trump administration proved him wrong.
Yeah.
That was the inside-out strategy. Solve the hardest problem, then you do the easier ones. The genius of the Abraham Accords is to do an outside-in strategy. You start with the countries that have never had a direct conflict with Israel and share interests with it, like Morocco and the UAE. Then you move into the countries that have a bit more conflict, like Saudi Arabia. And eventually, when the Palestinians realize that the Arab world isn't going to give them indefinite credit, they're going to be the ones who are going to sue for peace on the best terms they can get, instead of thinking that the Arab world will help them bleed Israel dry until they get the best terms that they want.
So where does Qatar fall into all this? Because they seem to be the pocketbook of this entire thing. The leadership is in Qatar. I know you said some nice things about our administration, and I understand why, but I'm an American, so I don't have to say nice things about my administration. To me, this war could have been over on October 8th. All Biden had to do was call Qatar and say, we're going to bomb Doha if you don't have these hostages released immediately. I don't think it would have been much more complex than that. Maybe I'm very simple and you can explain to me if I'm wrong.
Qatar is a deeply problematic actor.
They're funding the stuff on the campus.
From funding certain protests, or just Al Jazeera, which has done more than enough to brainwash people around the world, hosting Hamas leaders on their campuses, spending so much money on American campuses and think tanks in order to buy public opinion. This war could have ended very quickly if Qatar had threatened Hamas leaders in Qatar with arrest, deportation, unless they released the hostages.
But wouldn't that take United States pressure? They're not going to do it themselves. Yeah.
And if I may be critical of the United States, we're in
Florida. You're in a safe zone here.
We need to see serious pressure from the United States and the free world on Hamas and its backers, Qatar, Turkey, and Iran, to force them to let the hostages go. Hamas responds to pressure. Hamas will not respond to the UN Secretary General urging them to discover a sense of political courage. What the hell? Why is the UN Security General urging the terrorists who burned families alive on October 7th to find political courage? They don't need anyone telling them to be responsible or to discover the magnitude of the hour. They need serious pressure in order to choke off their funding supplies, choke off their pipelines, make it clear that they are isolated. And by the way, that is what I think was what was so powerful about the Prime Minister's speech in Congress, because Hamas leaders will be watching it from inside their tunnels in Gaza, seeing the Prime Minister of Israel getting standing ovation after standing ovation in the legislature of the most powerful country in the world and realizing that the walls are closing in on them. Instead, we found ourselves having an argument about how much Israel should allow itself to be blackmailed and extorted by a terrorist organization to get back babies brutally abducted from their beds on October 7th. How many terrorists we have to release. How much we have to jeopardize our national security by giving parts of Gaza back to Hamas, when the question should be, what pressure can the United States and its allies put on Hamas and its backers to let the hostages go? And I think it's important that the United States start acting like a superpower, not take a conflict-avoidant approach to resolving this problem with Hamas. Challenge it head-on. And I think the remarks by former President Trump saying that they have until November to release the hostages because if he comes into office and they haven't released them, there will be consequences, is exactly the line that the United States should be taking, instead of expecting that the terrorists who beheaded people on October 7th are going to respond to your calls for them to be responsible.
You were being very diplomatic for the first part of that answer, but I think we got the answer, actually, because that really is just the truth. They will only respond to one thing. Nobody wants war, but a little pressure, speak softly and carry a big stick. It does something. That's just reality.
I don't want for a moment to suggest that the United States has not put its backing behind Israel in getting the hostages back. And I've spoken to hostages' families who are so appreciative of the regular updates that they're getting from the administration, keeping them in the loop about the negotiations. But I'm saying Hamas's leaders are sleeping in hotels in the same country that hosts the biggest American army base in the Middle East.
Yeah.
You have leverage. And you should use it against the terrorist organization that is holding 8 American hostages, 5 of whom we presume are still alive.
Okay, so let's say there's a day after, or there will be a day after the war one way or another. Hopefully all the hostages come back alive, but wherever that falls out, let's put aside the North for a second. I mean, what does the day after look like at this point?
It depends what we mean by the day after, because as I said, this is not a war between Israel and a Palestinian terrorist group in Gaza. I wish that were the case. It's a war in which Israel is fighting for its life on those 7 fronts: Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Yemen. Iran is trying to destabilize Jordan to open an 8th front, and they're trying to get the Taliban on board to open a 9th front. And I mentioned attacks on Jews around the world, and that's the 10th front. So even if the war ends with Hamas, that still leaves the unresolved question of Hezbollah in the north. Now, let me tell you something. Hezbollah is not a terrorist organization. It's a terrorist army.
Yeah.
It's sitting on 200,000 missiles. That's more than all of NATO put together apart from the United States. It has a fighting force that can easily beat most NATO countries in battle, hands down. It is by far the most powerful army on Israel's borders, and it doesn't belong to the state of Lebanon. It is a proxy army that answers to the Iranian regime in Tehran. For 9 months now, they have been relentlessly bombarding northern Israel. And I've said they've forced people to flee from their homes. They can't go back. Those kids aren't going back to school in September. And the question is, what is Israel going to do about it? Now, it prefers a diplomatic resolution. Push Hezbollah away from the border, where the UN says it's supposed to go, north of the Litani River, so it can stop these attacks and people
Sure, but
can
the
go
UN
back to
is
their
in
homes.
on it. They've been on it this entire time.
Because Hezbollah has been using their peacekeepers as human shields and treats that UN resolution as a dish rag. It has zero confidence in it, zero respect for it, and they have no reason to have respect for it because the UN will only speak up and make it about both sides, or speaking about displaced Lebanese instead of talking about how Israel was the subject of an act of aggression by an Iranian proxy army that should not be there in the first place under the United Nations' own rules. So I'm saying, even if the war with Gaza winds down, and please God we get back all of the hostages alive, it still leaves that proxy army in the north. And it's possible that this conflict is going to segue into a much bigger war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's possible that that could get pushed off, but it might again sprout up in another 2 years. And for me and for Israel, the most important thing is to make sure that we have global support and backing to defend our borders and our freedoms and our people against the Iranian regime and its seven fronts, and start building a regional coalition to contain Iran and stop it from exporting radical Islam and exporting its revolution, instead of getting to a situation where the sword is on our throat and we end up with another potential October 7th from multiple fronts.
If you're looking for more enlightening conversations about international issues, check out our international playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist, all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.